Everyone in Lakeside Estates thought it was just another quiet Saturday morning. The lawns were freshly trimmed, the air was crisp, and the lake shimmered in the early sun like a mirror of calm. But calm is fragile, so fragile it can be shattered with a single voice, sharp enough to cut through a father's last attempt at healing his daughter's broken heart. "Excuse me, but what exactly do you think you're doing?" The words froze us in place. My daughter Solon had just reeled in her second bluegill, her face lighting up in a rare smile I hadn't seen since her mother died. That smile, the one thing keeping me alive, disappeared in an instant. The woman stood like a shadow on the dock, dressed in immaculate athleisure as though she were attending some private runway show. Blonde highlights perfectly in place, tablet clutched like a weapon, lips pursed in disapproval. She didn't look at us like neighbors. She looked at us like intruders. I swallowed the anger rising in my chest. "Good morning," I said softly, steadying my voice for Solon's sake. "Just enjoying some fishing with my daughter." I extended my hand, hoping kindness might ease the edge. "I'm Remy Thorncroft. We moved into the Sycamore Drive house about 2 months ago." Her eyes dropped to my hand, ignored it, then lifted back to her screen. Her fingers tapped in quick succession like a judge striking a gavel. "Fishing is explicitly prohibited in our community lake. This is a direct violation of HOA regulations. I'm Karen Wellington, HOA president." She said the title like it was royalty, not volunteer work. "The fine is $500. Solon's hands trembled around the fishing line. I felt her body stiffen beside me, eyes wide with a hurt no 14-year-old should carry. I clenched my jaw, forcing a calm I didn't feel. There must be some mistake. The realtor said fishing was one of the community amenities. It was a selling point for us. Karen's smile was razor thin. "The regulation was amended last month. All residents were notified by email. Ignorance of the rules doesn't excuse noncompliance." She turned the screen toward me, showing a freshly dated amendment. My inbox had no such message, but arguing in front of my daughter would only feed Karen's smugness. "Why was fishing banned?" I asked, still trying to reason. "Environmental and safety concerns," she replied without hesitation. "Hooks injure wildlife. The smell of bait disturbs residents. Not everyone wants to see this kind of activity while sipping their morning coffee." Her eyes flicked down at our modest tackle box with barely concealed disdain. It wasn't about rules, it was about us, about control. I forced a smile for my daughter's sake. "We'll pack up," I said gently, slipping an arm around Solon's shoulders. "Please email me the details." Karen's lips curved, victorious. "Excellent, I'm glad we understand each other. Do check your email more carefully in the future, Mr. Thorncroft. We wouldn't want further misunderstandings." With that, she spun on her designer sneakers and walked off, her shadow trailing behind her like a warning. The moment she left, Solon's eyes brimmed with tears. "Dad, why was that lady so mean? We weren't hurting anything." What could I say? That some people value rules more than they value people. That grief is invisible to those too cold to care. I put a hand on her shoulder. "Some people don't understand, sweetheart. Let's go home." But inside, I was seething. Later, after scouring every inbox folder, spam included, I confirmed what I already knew. No email, no warning, no fairness. That night, I sat at the window overlooking the lake. Across the water, I saw Karen holding a party at the gazebo with her friends, wine glasses lifted in laughter. No environmental concerns then. No safety worries when her rules bent for her benefit. Something snapped inside me. I'd spent my career navigating hostile takeovers and ruthless negotiations. I thought I'd left that world behind when Rachel died. But as I watched Karen parade around the lake as though she owned it, I realized something. If this woman thought she could strip away the only piece of peace I had left with my daughter, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The next morning, while walking through the neighborhood, I met Merrick Henderson, a retired attorney with silver hair and tired eyes that had clearly seen Karen's brand of tyranny before. When I told him what happened, his face darkened instantly. "Ah, so you've met our neighborhood dictator," he muttered. He invited me for coffee that afternoon, promising a collection of HOA horror stories. His study was lined with law books and photographs of a life well lived. Over steaming mugs, he leaned close, voice lowering, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Here, what most residents don't realize," Merrick said, spreading documents across the table. "That lake, it's not owned by the HOA, it's leased from the original developers, Meridian Corporation. And the lease," he tapped a date with his finger, "expires in less than 2 months." My breath caught, and then, "They'll either renew with the HOA, sell it to them, or sell it to anyone else." His eyes twinkled, like a man who had seen injustice for too long and suddenly glimpsed hope. I stared at the lake papers in silence, heart pounding. Karen thought she had power, but power was about ownership, and ownership was about timing. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to end this war before it even began. Because Karen Wellington had made one fatal mistake. She underestimated a grieving father with 4 million reasons to fight, and one daughter who deserved better. Everyone in that neighborhood thought Karen Wellington was untouchable. 8 years she'd ruled as president, 8 years of whispers, fines, and neighbors too afraid to speak up. But the moment Merrick slid those documents across his table, I realized something the rest of them hadn't yet dared to believe. Her empire was built on a lease, not a throne. And leases expire. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Solon's voice, trembling with confusion. "Dad, why was that lady so mean?" She hadn't just asked about Karen. She was asking about life, about fairness, about why people in power so often use it to wound instead of heal. And I'd given her the easy answer: some people just like rules more than people. But deep down, I wanted to show her something better. That bullies can be beaten, even the ones wearing pearls and polished smiles. The following day, Merrick introduced me to another neighbor, Samuel Washington. His presence was different, steady, commanding even in the quiet of his study. 60 years old, tall, sharp-eyed, and with the calm of a man who had seen storms and outlasted them. He had been one of the few who dared to stand against Karen before and paid for it. "Do you want to see how deep the rot goes?" Samuel asked me, his fingers gliding across his laptop. He pulled up a series of spreadsheets, each line a story of humiliation. "For years, I've tracked every HOA violation, every fine, every so-called random inspection. Do you notice the pattern?" My stomach tightened as I scanned the numbers. Families of color cited 3 times more often. Newcomers fined for the same infractions older residents ignored. Houses devalued, then quietly scooped up by shell companies tied to one name: Wellington. "She's been weaponizing the HOA to force people out," Samuel said, his voice low but steady. "She pushes them until they break, then buys the properties through her web of LLCs. And the lake," he leaned back, folding his hands. "The lake is her endgame." I thought back to Karen's thin smile, her eyes on Solon, her condescending tone. It wasn't about hooks or bait. It was about control, about money, about laying the groundwork for something bigger. "Meridian Development is bleeding cash," Samuel continued. "Karen knows this. She's already in talks to buy the lake through her company, not the HOA. Once she owns it, she'll build luxury homes on the shoreline. Fewer families will have access. And anyone who doesn't fit her image of lakeside estates," his eyes hardened, "they'll be gone." A fire lit in my chest. For weeks, I had tried to keep my head down to protect Solon from more hurt. But here, in this quiet study, I realized silence was exactly what Karen was counting on. She thrived on it. She grew powerful because good people stayed quiet. And I was done being quiet. That night, we gathered in secret. Merrick, Samuel, and a handful of neighbors who had been bruised by Karen's rule. We sat in the back of a small bakery owned by a sympathetic resident, the smell of bread mixing with tension in the air. Each person took a turn sharing their story. James Morris, a retired teacher, recalled how his Christmas lights, unchanged for 15 years, suddenly violated a brightness ordinance the moment he spoke against Karen at a council meeting. Maria Gonzalez, a foster mother, fought back tears as she described how her kids were banned from the pool for being too loud, when Karen's grandchildren wanted it. Diana Winters, a young widow, explained how Karen led an inspection through her backyard, then hit her with 5 violations in 2 days. It wasn't coincidence, it was strategy: isolate, pressure, break, buy. As their voices filled the room, something else grew stronger: resolve. For the first time, these neighbors weren't just victims telling stories in isolation. They were allies, a resistance, a community rediscovering its voice. I sat there, listening, and thought of Solon again. She had lost her mother. She needed a place that felt safe. And Karen had tried to rip away the one thing still tying us to Rachel: the water, the fishing, the quiet where grief could breathe. I wasn't just fighting for my home, I was fighting for my daughter's healing. Over the following weeks, Samuel set up a secure group chat. Neighbors began whispering "Me Too" in hushed tones, slipping into our secret gatherings, sharing evidence, photographs, timelines. We became a network under Karen's nose. Meanwhile, I dug into Karen's finances. My years in venture capital had taught me how to peel back layers of shell companies and hidden leverage. And what I found confirmed my suspicion: her empire was smoke and mirrors. Heavily mortgaged, over-leveraged, desperate for a win. She doesn't just want the lake, I told Merrick one evening as we spread papers across his dining table. She needs it. Without it, her house of cards collapses. That made her dangerous, but it also made her vulnerable. The plan began to take shape, whispered over coffee, scribbled on napkins, tightened with every passing day. We wouldn't strike yet. Not until she committed fully, not until her pride and her money were tied to the lake. We would let her dig her hole deeper, let her believe victory was certain. Then we'd take it from her in one brutal move. For now, we played the part of the quiet, frustrated residents. We let her believe her intimidation was working, even as more neighbors joined us in the shadows. But inside, I carried a new truth. Karen thought she had built herself an empire. She didn't realize she was standing on sand. And when the tide came in, it wouldn't just wash away her rules. It would wash away her crown. Everyone thought Karen's power was untouchable, but power has a strange way of unraveling. Sometimes it doesn't collapse all at once. Sometimes it frays at the edges, thread by thread, until one tug brings the whole thing down. And we were getting ready to tug. By the 3rd week of our secret gatherings, almost 30 households were quietly involved. That was a quarter of lakeside estates, too many for Karen to silence, though she tried. Her methods became more ruthless, her eyes sharper, her spies everywhere. The moment anyone so much as waved at me on the sidewalk, they'd find a notice on their door the next day. It started with me. Suddenly my lawn, which had passed every inspection since I moved in, was improperly maintained. A week later, I was cited for mailbox height, apparently off by an inch, though it had been approved when we bought the house. Then came a warning for unauthorized landscaping materials, followed by a fine because my garage door was the wrong shade of taupe. The absurdity would have been laughable if it hadn't been so relentless. 2 weeks, nearly $2,000 in violations, appeals, mysteriously lost, hearings, denied. Karen wasn't just flexing, she was testing, trying to see if I'd bend. But the one that broke me wasn't mine, it was Solon. She had left her bicycle in the driveway for 15 minutes while running inside to answer a phone call. 15 minutes. By the time she came back, a violation notice was already taped to our door with photographs. Someone had been watching, waiting, stalking my daughter just to punish us. When she saw the paper, her face fell. "Dad, they're watching us." Her voice shook, fragile like a bird realizing the sky isn't safe anymore. That night, she cried herself to sleep, and I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, fury coursing through me like fire. Karen had crossed a line. But anger wasn't enough. Not here, not against someone like her. If I fought with emotion, she'd win. No, this had to be calculated, cold, ruthless in its precision. I called Samuel and Merrick. "It's time," I said simply. That's when Samuel introduced me to Robert Chen, a real estate broker with inside knowledge of Meridian development. the company still holding the deed to the lake. We met at a coffee shop far from Lakeside Estates. Robert leaned across the table, speaking low. She's been trying to scrape together financing. About $300,000, structured over 18 months. Meridian gave her 60 days of exclusive negotiations, but they're desperate. If someone walked in with a better cash offer, he raised an eyebrow. They'd take it. And Karen, I asked. She doesn't have the money, not really. She's leveraged to the teeth. Without this deal, she's done. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at him. It was like seeing the outline of a door where you'd thought there was only a wall. How soon would they accept? I asked. Robert gave a tight smile. How soon can you write the check? I didn't answer immediately, because I already knew. I had the capital, I had the skill set, and now I had the perfect weapon. But Merrick urged patience. Let her announce her plans. Let her boast. The higher she climbs, the harder the fall. We wait until her pride has blinded her, then we pull the ground out from under her. It was the kind of strategy I had spent years perfecting in venture capital. Wait until the deal is public, let your opponent overcommit, then strike at the moment of maximum damage. It was risky, but if it worked, it would destroy her credibility, not just her plan. So we waited. And Karen, oblivious, escalated. She launched a smear campaign, whispering that I was unstable, financially reckless, a troublemaker. One day Solon came home from school in tears. The kids said we don't belong here. They said you're ruining everything. It broke me to hear it. I nearly called a realtor that night, nearly packed our bags, but when I told Merrick, he snapped me back. That's what she wants, that's how she wins. She's done this before. Families buckle under the weight, sell for cheap, and she swoops in. Don't give her that satisfaction. He was right, and I couldn't let my daughter learn that bullies get to decide when you leave. Days later, the call came. Meridian was ready to deal. All it would take was $350,000 in cash, a signed agreement, and the lake would belong to me. I looked at the papers, felt the pen in my hand. The weight of everything settled over me, Rachel's absence, Solon's tears, Karen's smug smile. This wasn't just a purchase. This was justice. And for the first time in months, I felt calm. Because Karen thought she had me trapped. But the truth was, she was the one walking blindfolded into my trap. Everyone thought the HOA ran Lakeside Estates. Everyone thought Karen was in control. What no one knew, not even Karen herself, was that the very ground beneath her feet had already been sold out from under her, and the lake she dreamed of owning now belonged to me. It happened quietly, without ceremony. Just a simple signature in a downtown law office, my name hidden behind a newly created LLC. $350,000 wired in full. 7 days later, the deed was mine. 6 acres of water, 10 feet of shoreline, and the one thing Karen couldn't bully out of my hands. I remember staring at that piece of paper after signing it, my chest tight with a mix of triumph and fear. Triumph, because I had beaten her at her own game. Fear, because revealing it too soon could ruin everything. Timing was everything. And Karen was already setting herself up for a spectacular fall. 2 days after I closed the deal, she scheduled a special HOA meeting. Flyers went out. An email blast followed. Residents whispered about big improvements and prestige projects. I didn't need to wonder, I already knew. That night, I peeked at the bulletin board by the clubhouse. Renderings in glossy ink showed her grand vision. A private lakeside lounge, trimmed lawns cutting into the water, fishing docks erased to make space for exclusive amenities. In other words, her personal playground, funded by our fees. I didn't say a word. Not to my daughter, not to my neighbors. Only Merrick and Samuel knew the truth, that Karen's crown jewel had already slipped from her grasp. But she wasn't done. Karen called an emergency meeting, standing tall at the podium in front of nearly 50 residents. Behind her, a PowerPoint screen glowed, elevating Lakeside Estates, a premier vision. She spoke with the practiced confidence of someone who thought she was untouchable. "This is not just about today," she declared. "It's about the future. Our lake must be reimagined, elevated, modernized. This plan will increase property values, bring prestige, and ensure our community remains one of the most desirable in the county." Applause trickled in, mostly from her loyal circle. Others looked uneasy. But Karen didn't pause. She laid out a special assessment, $50 per household every month, supposedly for lake improvements. In reality, her war chest to buy the lake. And then came the dagger. Without nomming me directly, she said, "Of course, not everyone shares our community values. Certain elements, newer residents, have been undermining property values, spreading instability." She let the words hang. My name didn't need to be spoken. Everyone knew. I gripped the edge of my chair, nails digging into the wood. Solon sat beside me, her small hand gripping mine, eyes wide with confusion. She didn't deserve this public shamming. When Samuel stood to defend me, Karen cut him down with venomous sweetness. "Mr. Washington, perhaps your time would be better spent putting your own house in order. After all, the IRS had some questions for you not long ago, didn't they?" Gasps rippled across the room. The tax issue had been resolved years ago, a clerical error. But Karen spun it like poison, leaving Samuel humiliated under the weight of her smirk. And then she turned her gaze on Sapphira Duskland, a florist who had timidly asked if residents should vote before altering lake use. Karen's eyes hardened. "Sapphira, isn't your shop lease up soon? It would be such a shame if there were complications." Silence fell, fear thickened the air. Karen had them all by the throat. But I sat there, strangely calm, because I knew something she didn't. She didn't own the lake. I did. And in that moment, her arrogance became my weapon. That night, after tucking Solon into bed, I stared at the deed again. The words were simple, cold, final. Property owner, Thorncroft Holdings, LLC. I whispered to myself, "They brought this fight to my daughter. Now I'll show them what happens when you try to break someone who knows how to break systems." Within 48 hours, I withdrew the money, signed the last of the papers. The ink was barely dry when I began preparing for the storm that would follow. Because Karen had no idea the foundation of her empire had already crumbled. And soon, very soon, the whole neighborhood would watch it collapse. Everyone saw the party as just another one of Karen's grand gestures, a showcase of her power, her influence, her grip on lakeside estates. But for me, it was the stage I had been waiting for. And Karen, blinded by her arrogance, had no idea she was about to walk straight into my trap. The weeks leading up to it were brutal. Karen must have sensed I was slipping through her fingers because her harassment reached new levels. Violation notices arrived daily, each one more absurd than the last. Improper weed control, mailbox dimensions off by half an inch, a citation because Solon's backpack had been left on our porch too long. And it wasn't just me anymore. Maria Gonzalez, her lawn cited for being a quarter-inch too high. James Morris, fined for a bird feeder he'd had for a decade. Diana Winters, penalized because her recycling bin was 6 inches too close to the garage. It was a campaign, systematic and cruel, meant to break us one by one. But instead of breaking us, it bound us tighter. Each fine became fuel. Each notice another reason for neighbors to whisper, to text, to show up at our quiet gatherings. By the third week, nearly 1/3 of the community was quietly allied against Karen, and she didn't even know. Still, her attacks cut deep. The hardest was the day Solon came home from school, tears streaming down her face. "Dad," Brianna said, her mom told her, "we don't belong here, that you're ruining everything, that we're troublemakers." I wanted to pull her into my arms and tell her it didn't matter, but it did matter. To a 14-year-old girl, every whisper mattered. That night, when she finally cried herself to sleep, I sat in the dark, my fists clenched. I almost called a realtor, almost packed our things to leave. But Merrick's voice echoed in my head. "That's what she wants. She hounds people until they sell. Don't give her that satisfaction." So I didn't. The turning point came when I got the call from Meridian's lawyer. The environmental assessment was complete, the paperwork finalized. The lake officially belonged to me. And the timing couldn't have been sweeter. Because Karen had just scheduled her crowning moment, a massive lakeside party, complete with catered food, music, and an audience of her most loyal supporters. She wanted to cement her claim on the lake, to make it hers in the eyes of the community. But the truth was, it wasn't hers anymore. That Saturday afternoon, the lake was alive with music and laughter. Tables draped in white cloths lined the shore. Wine bars glistened in the sunlight. Neighbors mingled, their laughter carrying across the water. And there, at the center of it all, was Karen, smiling, radiant, certain of her power. I walked in with Merrick on one side, Samuel on the other, and two unexpected guests trailing behind us. My attorney and a uniformed police officer, I had briefed on the situation. Karen's smile faltered the moment she saw me. "This is a private event," she snapped, hurrying forward. "You weren't invited." I reached for the microphone she had been using and held it firmly, my voice steady. "Actually, Karen, I think there's been some confusion about who exactly should be inviting whom." The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through the air. I nodded to my attorney, who handed me a folder. "As the legal owner of this lake and the 10 feet of shoreline surrounding it, I'm informing you all that you are currently trespassing on private property." Silence, absolute silence. Karen's face went pale. "What are you talking about? This is HOA property." I held up the deed for everyone to see. "Not anymore. Meridian Development sold it, to me." Gasps tore through the crowd. Karen's composure cracked, her voice sharp with panic. "You can't do this. The community has rights, binding agreements." "Agreements," I said evenly, "that expire in 28 days, and that I, as owner, have already terminated due to your violations." I gestured to the officer beside me. "So you have 15 minutes to gather your belongings and leave my property." The officer's expression was firm, his presence undeniable. For a moment, Karen just stood there, her face a storm of disbelief and rage. Then, realizing the crowd's eyes weren't on me, they were on her, she faltered. And in that silence, I delivered the line I had been holding for weeks. "Karen, you've always insisted on rules. Well, today, you finally have to follow them." The murmurs swelled, shifting, turning. Neighbors who once clapped for her now whispered in anger. Parents pulled their kids away from the lake. People began packing up tables and folding chairs. Karen's party collapsed in front of her eyes. And as the last guest walked away, shooting her a look of betrayal, I realized something. The battle wasn't just about ownership anymore. It was about exposing her for who she really was. And now, for the first time, the mask had cracked. Everyone thought Karen would bounce back. That somehow, like she always had, she'd twist the rules, call in her favors, and claw her way out of the mess. But what no one realized, not even Karen, was that this time she wasn't fighting a neighbor. She was fighting the truth. And truth, once revealed, doesn't crawl back into the shadows. The day after her party collapsed, Karen called an emergency board meeting. Word spread fast, doors closed, voices raised behind tinted windows. Through our network, we learned the agenda: find out who bought the lake, strategize, spin the narrative. But what Karen didn't know was that while she was scrambling, I was already moving. First, I filed paperwork to terminate the recreational use agreement, officially, legally, permanently. The HOA's rights to the lake were gone. Then I hired a water quality expert and a conservation team. They tested the water, studied the soil, took samples. The results were worse than I expected. Years of fertilizer runoff had poisoned the ecosystem. The fish were stressed. The algae bloom was unnatural. The HOA had spent years pretending to protect the environment while quietly neglecting it. That became my weapon. 1 week later, I stood before reporters with my daughter at my side, announcing plans to restore the lake. "This water has been mistreated for too long. We're transforming it into a conservation and education space, a place for kids to learn about ecology, to fish responsibly, to heal. I didn't say Rachel's name, but Solon knew, and when she squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with a pride I hadn't seen since her mother died, I knew I'd made the right choice. But Karen, she was furious. She tried everything. Lawsuits, dismissed. Smear campaigns, ignored. She whispered to her allies that the lake was polluted, dangerous, a liability. I countered with hard science, publishing the test results, proving it was healthier than it had been in years. And then the tide turned. Safira, the timid florist Karen had once threatened, stood up in a board meeting. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger with each word. I've watched Karen manipulate this community for years. She's targeted homeowners unfairly, diverted funds to her friends. Last year, we spent $80,000 to renovate a park used by 10 families, all close to her, while rejecting basic playground equipment for the park dozens of kids use every day. Gasps filled the room, and just like that, fear began to crumble. Others spoke up, a teacher, a single mother, a retiree. Years of silence cracked open, the truth spilling out like floodwater, and once it started, there was no stopping it. Karen's allies, sensing the shift, began to backpedal. Some even showed up at my door, their voices low, shame in their eyes. My son really wants to learn to fish, one admitted. Could he join your conservation program? These were the same people who had mocked me weeks before. Now, desperation softened their edges. I set one rule. No child of a sitting HOA board member could join, not until their parents stepped down. Petty, maybe, but effective. Within days, resignations began. Veronica Palmer, one of Karen's loudest supporters, quit publicly. 2 others followed. The board fractured. Karen's circle shrank. And then came the desperate act that sealed her fate. One night, my security cameras caught Karen herself, sneaking to the water's edge with 2 of her allies. In her hand, a small bottle. She poured it into the lake, glancing nervously around. A toxic chemical. An attempt to fake pollution, to destroy the very thing she couldn't control. The footage was clear. I sent it straight to the police. By morning, Karen Wellington, the untouchable queen of Lakeside Estates, was in handcuffs, charged with trespassing, charged with attempted environmental contamination. And as investigators dug deeper, more rot surfaced: misused funds, shady property deals, evidence she had manipulated families out of their homes. The woman who had once stood at the podium like royalty now sat in a courtroom, her name spoken in the same breath as fraud and embezzlement. And the neighborhood that once feared her, they weren't whispering anymore. They were watching her fall. Everyone in Lakeside Estates had seen Karen fall before, little stumbles, moments where she overreached but always recovered. But this time, there would be no recovery. Not when the mask was gone. Not when her empire was exposed as nothing more than paper and threats. The night after her arrest, I invited nearly every resident, everyone except the sitting HOA board, into my home. My living room overflowed with neighbors, some cautious, some hopeful, all tired of living under Karen's thumb. For the first time since Rachel's death, I felt something I hadn't in months: momentum. I stood before them with the deed in one hand and a folder in the other. "This lake isn't mine," I said. "Not really. It belongs to this community, and I intend to give it back, but not without conditions." The room quieted, every eye on me. First, the HOA leadership must be restructured. Term limits, transparent elections, no more endless presidencies. Second, every regulation will be reviewed and rewritten for fairness. And third, an independent ethics committee will be established, rotating members, so no one ever again uses power the way Karen did. A murmur ran through the crowd, cautious but intrigued. Then I dropped the final piece, the part even Merrick and Samuel didn't know. Over the past month, I've been quietly purchasing mortgage notes through my contacts at Lakeside National Bank. Nearly 20% of this community's homes, including Karen's, perfectly legal. And with that ownership comes leverage. Gasps, whispers, people shifting in their seats, some eyes wide with fear. I raised a hand to calm them. I have no intention of foreclosing, no intention of harming anyone. In fact, I'll offer refinancing below market rates to every homeowner here, but only if we rebuild this community the right way together. If we don't change, if we let this place rot under the weight of corruption again, then nothing else matters. Not the lake, not the homes, not the future. The room erupted. Applause, shouts of agreement, even tears from some who had suffered too long in silence. For once, the HOA wasn't feared, it was challenged. When the vote came, it wasn't even close. Nearly unanimous. Karen Wellington was removed from power, the old board dissolved, and a new slate of leaders, led by Safira Dusklund, the timid florist who had found her voice, was elected. Karen tried to fight it. She arrived at the meeting, her lawyer in tow, her face pale but defiant. "You can't do this. This is illegal. I'll sue every one of you." But the room didn't flinch. People who once bowed their heads now met her eyes. They weren't afraid anymore. They had seen too much. And then Merrick stepped forward, holding up a small recorder. "Karen," he said calmly, "would you like me to play back the part where you tried to bribe me, or the part where you suggested contaminating the lake yourself?" The silence that followed was crushing. Karen's lawyer paled. Karen's face went slack, and for the first time in years she had nothing to say. 2 weeks later, she resigned in disgrace, her real estate empire unraveling as lawsuits piled in. Her home went up for sale. No one wanted it. She vanished like a storm that finally burned itself out. The lake, meanwhile, took on a new name, Rachel's Lake. My daughter's smile when the sign was unveiled, that was worth more than every dollar I'd spent. We hosted a community fishing day, kids laughing, parents talking across fences that once divided them. For the first time in years, Lakeside Estates felt like a neighborhood, not a battlefield. And as Solon leaned against me on the dock that evening, watching the sun dip low across water that finally belonged to everyone, she whispered, "Mom would be proud of you." I swallowed the lump in my throat, kissed the top of her head, and whispered back, "I think she'd be proud of us both." Everyone thought the story ended with Karen's resignation. With her house on the market, her name whispered in shame, and her empire in ashes. But endings aren't always so clean. True endings, the kind that matter, come not when the villain falls, but when the people they hurt finally rise. 1 year later, Lakeside Estates was unrecognizable. The fences that once divided neighbors had become meeting points. Kids played together in the parks without whispers of whose parents belonged on which side. Families who had hidden behind closed curtains now hosted cookouts, laughter echoing down streets that had long felt suffocated. Rachel's Lake had become the heartbeat of it all. Every Saturday, children lined the docks with poles in hand, their eyes wide with excitement as volunteers taught them about fish, water, and conservation. My daughter, Solon, helped run the program. Watching her teach younger kids how to bait hooks, her laughter carrying across the water, I saw the girl I thought grief had stolen forever. The HOA itself transformed. Term limits, transparent elections, a rotating ethics committee that met monthly, ensuring fairness. Safira Dusklund, once too afraid to challenge Karen, now led as president, her quiet determination guiding every decision. People respected her not for her power but for her honesty. And word spread beyond our gates. Neighboring communities came to see what we'd built. They studied our new charter, our safeguards. Some even adopted our model, rewriting their own rules. We became an example of what could happen when people refused to stay silent. Karen, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. Lawsuits drained what little she had left. Her real estate company collapsed. Her allies scattered. And when her name did appear, it was no longer in whispers of fear, but as a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. Life gave me choices too. Some suggested I run for mayor after James Wilson bowed out, his own reputation tarnished by his ties to Karen. But politics was never what I wanted. Instead, I honored Rachel in a different way, by establishing a scholarship fund for children who had lost a parent to cancer. It was her legacy, her love for community and family, carried forward. One evening, months after the dust had settled, Solon and I sat on the dock as the sun painted the lake gold. Families were still gathered nearby, some fishing, some just talking, the quiet hum of peace replacing years of tension. Solon leaned against me, her voice soft but certain. "You didn't just buy a lake, Dad. You gave everyone back their home." I wrapped an arm around her, the weight of everything washing over me. For so long, grief had felt like an anchor, but in that moment I realized it had become something else, a compass. Sometimes, defeating a bully isn't about shouting louder, hitting harder, or becoming the monster you fight. Sometimes, the real victory comes from rewriting the rules, from turning their weapons into tools for healing. And as I watched the reflection of the sunset ripple across Rachel's lake, I knew this wasn't just our victory. It was a reminder, for anyone watching, for anyone listening, that no matter how powerful someone seems, no matter how small you feel, there's always a way to fight back. You just have to know when to wait, when to strike, and when to build something better in the ashes of what was broken. Because justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about rebuilding a life, a family, a community. And that, more than anything, is what made Rachel's Lake ours. Forever. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.